They called it a tomb of dried grass. When Catherine Bennet began stuffing tightly bound sheaves of hay between the double timber walls of her cabin, the valley echoed with laughter. They said she was building a tinderbox, begging for a swift death. They had no idea she was building a fortress. The Dakota Territory, in the late autumn of 1883, was an unforgiving expanse of prairie grass and biting winds. Settlers who had journeyed west seeking fortune and acreage quickly learned that the land demanded a heavy toll for survival. Among the newest arrivals to the Bitter Creek settlement was Catherine Bennet, a woman whose black mourning dress was covered in the pale dust of the trail. She had lost her husband, William, to pneumonia during their trek, leaving her with a meager herd of 4 dairy cows, a draft horse, and a plot of land on the exposed northern ridge of the valley. The established men of Bitter Creek were a prideful lot. Harrison Miller, a man who had made his fortune in cattle, had just finished constructing a sprawling, blood-red barn that dominated the landscape. It was built fast and built large, with single-plank pine walls soaring 40 feet high. Josiah Calloway, the self-appointed mayor and proprietor of the general store, lived in a grand 2-story house that looked as though it had been plucked from a wealthy Boston suburb and dropped onto the dirt. To them, Catherine was an object of pity, and soon an object of ridicule. Knowing winter was approaching, Catherine hired 2 local farmhands to help her frame her cabin, but instead of the standard single-wall construction, she demanded they build 2 parallel walls, leaving a gap of exactly 24 inches between the interior and exterior planks. The men grumbled about the waste of lumber, but Catherine paid them in silver and sent them away before the roof was even fully shingled. For the next 3 weeks, Catherine did not rest. From before dawn until long past dusk, she was in the fields, scything the tall, wild prairie grass, sweet grass, and late-season alfalfa. She laid it out to cure in the weak autumn sun, turning it relentlessly until it was perfectly dry. Then, bundle by bundle, she began hauling it into her unfinished cabin. She packed the dried forage into the 2-foot gap between her walls. She used a heavy iron tamping rod to force the hay down, compressing it until it was as dense as a brick. She filled every wall, floor to ceiling, sealing it shut with heavy pine boards. It didn't take long for the town to notice. Harrison Miller rode his massive roan stallion up to her property line one brisk Tuesday morning. He sat in his saddle, chewing on a matchstick, watching Catherine haul another massive sheaf of alfalfa toward her door. "You've lost your senses, Widow Bennet," Harrison called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've seen some foolish things out here, but building a house out of kindling takes the prize. One stray spark from your hearth, and you'll go up like a Roman candle. You're packing horse feed in your walls." Catherine paused, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of a calloused hand. She looked at Harrison's distant, massive barn, shivering slightly in the wind. "A well-tended hearth doesn't throw sparks, Mr. Miller, and a well-insulated house doesn't freeze." "Insulated?" Harrison threw his head back and laughed, the sound sharp and mocking in the crisp air. "Wood and iron, Catherine. That's what stops the wind. Not dead weeds. You should have spent your time building a proper barn for those scrawny cows of yours, instead of stuffing your walls like a scarecrow. When the snows come, those animals will freeze, and you'll burn." Catherine didn't argue. She knew what they didn't. She had survived a winter in the high mountains of Colorado as a child. She had seen how the native tribes utilized earth and dried flora to trap heat. Furthermore, she knew a bitter truth about pioneer life. When the blizzards hit and the drifts piled higher than the rooftops, getting to a barn just 50 yards away could become a death sentence. She kept her silence, turned her back on Harrison Miller, and continued packing the walls. By early November, Catherine was completely ostracized. The women of Bitter Creek, led by the gossiping tongues of Abigail Foster and Sarah Linwood, would draw their shawls tight and cross the dirt road whenever Catherine walked into town for supplies. "It's the grief," Abigail whispered loudly one afternoon near the flour barrels in Calloway's store. "It's driven the poor woman mad, living in a giant haystack. My husband says it's a menace to the whole valley." Josiah Calloway, leaning over the counter, nodded gravely. "I've a mind to call a town meeting. If that cabin catches fire in a high wind, the embers could carry all the way to the town centre." They did call a meeting. On a frosty Thursday evening, Catherine was summoned to the schoolhouse. The room was packed, smelling of wet wool, pipe tobacco, and self-righteousness. Josiah Calloway stood at the front, his thumbs hooked into his vest pockets. "Mrs. Bennet," Josiah began, his tone patronizingly gentle, "we are concerned for your safety, and for ours. Storing highly combustible material within the living quarters of a home is reckless. We are asking you, as a community, to tear down the interior walls and remove the hay." Catherine stood up. She was a small woman, but her posture was as rigid as the iron rod she used to pack her walls. "My property is a half-mile from the nearest structure, Mayor Calloway. Even if it were to burn, which it will not, the wind would have to carry embers across the creek and uphill to reach any of you. It's a matter of principle," Harrison Miller barked from the back row. "We don't need madness taking root in Bitter Creek. Next, you'll be bringing your livestock inside to sleep in your bed." Laughter erupted through the schoolhouse. Catherine's cheeks burned, but her eyes remained cold. "I won't be tearing down my walls," Catherine said evenly, her voice slicing through the laughter. "I built this home to survive. I suggest you all look to your own structures. Mr. Miller, your barn is grand, but the timber is green and the joints are rushed. When the snow settles on that vast, flat roof, I pray your cattle have strong backs." The room went dead silent. Insulting a man's property was a dangerous game. Harrison's face turned a mottled purple, but before he could speak, Catherine turned and walked out into the freezing night. The first frost came hard the next morning. It was a vicious, snapping cold that turned the mud of the roads into jagged iron ruts. Yet, inside Catherine's cabin, the atmosphere was profoundly different. The tightly packed hay acted as a thermal barrier unlike anything the valley had seen. With only a modest fire burning in her reinforced stone hearth, the cabin remained incredibly warm. The thick walls absorbed the heat and trapped it, blocking the howling wind completely. But Catherine's preparations weren't finished. Because she hadn't built a barn, she had constructed a sturdy, enclosed lean-to directly attached to the back of her cabin, sharing the heavily insulated rear wall. A small, reinforced door connected her living space directly to the animal pen. Her 4 cows and the draft horse were brought in, their collective body heat adding to the warmth of the structure. Thanksgiving passed with a false sense of security. The townspeople celebrated, looking at their massive, drafty barns filled with loose hay and their uninsulated clapboard houses. They felt civilized. They felt secure. Then came the second week of December. It didn't begin with a roar, but with an eerie, breathless silence. The sky bruised to a terrifying shade of violet grey. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, falling 30 degrees in a matter of hours. Water froze mid-pour from the pitchers. By nightfall, the wind arrived. It was the beginning of the Great White Hurricane, a storm that would be etched into the gravestones of the Dakota Territory. The snow fell so thickly that a man couldn't see his own hand stretched out in front of his face. The wind shrieked at 70 miles an hour, driving the icy shards into every crack, every keyhole, and every poorly joined plank in Bitter Creek. Inside her cabin, Catherine sat by the fire, knitting. She could hear the muffled roar of the tempest outside, but the thick walls of packed hay absorbed the vibration and the sound. She walked to the back door, opened it, and stepped into the lean-to. It was dark, but warm. The cows chewed their cud peacefully, completely unaware of the deadly frozen hell raging just inches away on the other side of the timber. Catherine patted her horse's neck, a grim sense of dread settling in her stomach. She was safe. But as she listened to the demonic howling of the wind, she knew the arrogant men of Bitter Creek were about to face a reckoning. Across the valley, Harrison Miller was awake, staring in horror at his bedroom window. The glass was coated in 2 inches of solid ice on the inside, and over the roar of the wind he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a massive, agonizing groan of overstressed timber coming from the direction of his prized, sprawling barn. The blizzard did not assault Bitter Creek. It consumed it. For 3 days and 3 nights, the sun was utterly banished, replaced by a screaming vortex of pulverized ice that scoured the Dakota plains like a sand blaster. The snow did not fall from the sky. It drove sideways, a horizontal wall of blinding, suffocating white that made breathing outside impossible. The temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero, freezing the very sap inside the dormant oak trees until their trunks split with gunshot-loud cracks that echoed terrifyingly through the shrieking wind. In his grand 2-story house, Mayor Josiah Calloway was learning the brutal difference between appearance and endurance. The Boston-style clapboard house, with its elegant high ceilings and tall imported glass windows, was a veritable icebox. The wind found every minuscule gap between the siding, every uncorked seam around the sashes, driving fine, powdery snow straight into the parlor. By the second morning, a drift had formed across Josiah's Persian rug. Josiah and his wife huddled in the kitchen, the smallest room in the house, feeding their magnificent iron stove. But their firewood was stored in a handsome timber shed 50 yards behind the house. To step outside was to invite death. A man could lose his direction after 3 steps, becoming completely disoriented in the whiteout, only to freeze to death mere feet from his own back door. When their small indoor supply of kindling ran out, desperation took hold. Josiah, stripped of his mayoral dignity and shivering uncontrollably, took a heavy steel felling axe to his expensive mahogany dining chairs, then the parlor tables, and finally the intricately carved oak banister of his grand staircase. They burned their wealth just to keep their blood moving. 2 miles away, Harrison Miller was experiencing a nightmare of his own making. The roaring wind was a physical weight against his home, but his terror was entirely focused on the sprawling, blood-red barn he had built to house his prized cattle. Harrison had built it vast, proud, and fast. He had used green timber, unseasoned pine that still held moisture, and he had spanned the massive roof with too few supports, valuing square footage over structural integrity. On the evening of the second day, over the deafening howl of the tempest, Harrison heard it. It started as a deep, resonant groan, a sound of immense agony vibrating through the frozen earth. It was the sound of colossal stress. The heavy, wet snow, driven by the hurricane winds, had piled relentlessly onto the flat, wide expanse of the barn's roof. The green timber, already brittle from the unnatural cold, was bowing under tons of accumulated ice and snow. Harrison rushed to his iced-over window, scratching frantically at the frost with a silver butter knife. He peered out into the grey-white void. He couldn't see the barn, but he could hear the structural joints screaming. "Wyatt!" Harrison bellowed to his foreman, who was huddled near the hearth. "Grab the ropes. We have to tie off and get to the barn. The roof is giving way." Wyatt, a seasoned frontiersman with a scarred face and cold eyes, shook his head slowly. "You go out there, Mr. Miller. You're a dead man. No rope is going to hold in that crosswind. And if that roof comes down, you want to be under it when it does? Those are my prize heifers, my entire livelihood," Harrison screamed, his face flushed with panic and rage. He grabbed a heavy woolen coat and a coil of hemp rope. He tied one end around his waist and secured the other to the heavy iron anvil on his porch. He wrapped a scarf over his face, leaving only a slit for his eyes, and pushed his front door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow from a heavy wooden mallet, knocking him backward. It took all of his strength just to push the door open enough to squeeze through. The cold was absolute. It seared his lungs and instantly froze the moisture in his eyes. He waded into the whiteout, following the direction of the barn from memory. He took 5 steps, then 10. The world was nothing but roaring, violent white. He couldn't see his feet. He couldn't see the house behind him. Then came the crack. It was a sound so loud, so violently destructive, it pierced the howling wind like an artillery shell. A massive, concussive boom vibrated through the snowdrifts, knocking Harrison off his feet. The sprawling red barn, unable to bear the immense, crushing weight of the snow and the punishing lateral force of the wind, had catastrophically failed. The central ridge beam snapped like a dry twig. The green timber walls blew outward, and the massive roof pancaked downward, burying 50 head of cattle under hundreds of tons of splintered pine, iron nails, and compacted ice. Harrison lay in the snow, screaming into the wind, but the sound was whipped away instantly. The rope around his waist suddenly yanked taut as Wyatt, terrified for his boss, hauled him backward, hand over hand. Harrison was dragged back to the porch, frostbitten, sobbing, and utterly ruined. His pride and joy had become a mass grave in a matter of seconds. Meanwhile, on the exposed northern ridge, Catherine Bennett sat in a rocking chair, a patchwork quilt draped over her knees, reading a leather-bound Bible by the warm, steady light of a kerosene lamp. The contrast was staggering. The ferocious wind that was tearing the settlement apart battered against Catherine's cabin, but the structure did not shudder. The double timber walls, packed tight with 2 feet of dense, compressed hay, formed an impenetrable fortress. The hay acted as a supreme insulator, trapping the heat from her modest stone hearth so effectively that Catherine occasionally had to crack a window just to let some of the warmth out. The ambient noise of the hurricane was muffled, reduced to a distant, dull roar that sounded like ocean waves breaking on a far-off shore. But Catherine's genius went beyond mere insulation. By the end of the second day, a new problem arose. The storm showed no signs of breaking, and the 4 dairy cows and draft horse housed in her attached lean-to had eaten through their small trough of feed. They were restless, lowing hungrily in the dark enclosure. Catherine couldn't open the heavy exterior door to reach the small pasture. The snowdrift against the back of the cabin was likely 10 feet high. Calmly, Catherine set down her Bible. She walked over to the western interior wall of her cabin. She picked up a heavy iron crowbar from the hearth. With practiced precision, she wedged the flat edge of the iron under a pine interior plank and pulled. The nails groaned and the board popped free. She removed a second, then a third. Behind the planks lay the dense, tightly packed wall of dried alfalfa and sweet grass. It smelled faintly of summer, a rich, earthy aroma of sunshine and earth that filled the small room. Catherine reached in, grabbed a large handful of the perfectly preserved dry forage, and pulled it free. The settlers had mocked her for building a tinderbox. They had laughed at her for stuffing her walls with horse feed. What they had failed to realize was that Catherine had not just insulated her home, She had built a living pantry. The walls of her house were an emergency silo. Catherine carried the fragrant bundles of hay through the small connecting door into the lean-to. The cows moved in eagerly, their warm breath pluming in the dim light as they began to chew. The draft horse nickered in appreciation. Catherine patted their thick winter coats, smiling softly. She had enough hay packed in the 4 walls of her cabin to feed her animals for 2 months if necessary, and as she removed the hay from the inner cavity, the remaining thickness was still more than enough to keep the freezing cold at bay. She was systematically eating her house to keep her livestock alive, and it was working flawlessly. As the storm raged on, tearing the haughty settlement of Bitter Creek to splinters, the widow Bennet simply sat by her fire, pulling sustenance from her very walls, a solitary bastion of warmth and survival in a frozen hell. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. The wind died down to a sharp, biting breeze, and the heavy violet clouds finally fractured, revealing a sky of brilliant, agonizingly bright blue. The sun reflected off the pristine, endless white expanse, blinding anyone who dared look at it without squinting. Bitter Creek was unrecognizable. The landscape had been entirely rewritten by the wind. Houses were buried up to their 2nd-story windows in massive, sculpted drifts. The roads were gone, replaced by frozen dunes of ice. It took Josiah Calloway 3 hours to dig his way out of his front door. When he finally breached the surface, gasping the frigid air, he looked around at his town. It was a scene of utter devastation. Several smaller shacks had been blown over entirely, but the most shocking sight was the Miller property, where the magnificent, sprawling red barn had stood. There was only an immense mound of snow, pierced violently by jagged, splintered beams of green pine thrusting upward like broken ribs. A few surviving townsfolk had already gathered near the wreckage, wielding shovels in a desperate, futile attempt to dig through the debris. Josiah waded through the chest-high snow, his legs burning with the effort. When he reached the ruins, he found Harrison Miller sitting on a broken roof truss, his face grey, his hands wrapped in bloody rags from frostbite. He looked hollowed out, a man whose soul had been crushed alongside his fortune. The muffled, pitiful sounds of the few surviving animals trapped deep beneath the collapsed timber were sickening. "Harrison!" Josiah breathed, horrified. "My God, the whole structure!" "It snapped," Harrison whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "The wind took it, and the snow crushed it. I lost them all, Josiah. Every last head." Abigail Foster and Sarah Linwood arrived soon after, their faces wrapped heavily in wool scarves, their eyes wide with shock. They had barely survived the night in their own drafty homes, huddled together under every blanket they owned. "We need to take inventory," Josiah said, trying to muster his mayoral authority, despite the soot staining his face from burning his own furniture. "We need to check on everyone. Who is unaccounted for?" The small group looked around. One by one, battered and exhausted settlers emerged from the snowdrifts, looking like ghosts. They had survived, but just barely. They were freezing, hungry, and terrified. "What about the widow Bennet?" Wyatt, Harrison's foreman, asked suddenly, pointing a thick, leather-gloved finger toward the northern ridge. The townspeople fell silent. They all turned to look at the distant hill. It was completely buried in a massive, sweeping drift of snow. "She's on the most exposed part of the valley," Harrison muttered, staring blankly at the snow. Her cabin was just single planks and dried grass. If the wind didn't blow it apart, the cold finished her. "She's dead." "We still have to look," Josiah said heavily. "It's our Christian duty. Bring the shovels. We have to dig her out for a proper burial." It was a grim, agonizing procession. 10 men, led by Josiah and a broken Harrison, took turns breaking a trail through the deep, compacted snow toward the northern ridge. It took them nearly 2 hours to traverse the half-mile distance. Their lungs burned and their muscles cramped, driven only by a morbid sense of obligation to the woman they had relentlessly mocked. As they crested the final rise, the wind shifted, carrying a scent that made Josiah stop dead in his tracks. It was the smell of wood smoke, rich, fragrant, and undeniable. The men pushed forward frantically. As they rounded the massive snowdrift that had accumulated against the windward side of the property, they saw it. Catherine Bennett's cabin stood absolute and defiant. The snow was piled high against the exterior, but the structure itself was perfectly intact. Not a single plank was bowed, not a single shingle was missing, and pouring merrily from the sturdy stone chimney was a thick, steady plume of white smoke. Josiah dropped his shovel. Harrison stared, his mouth slightly open, his frost-bitten hands trembling. They waded up to the front door. The snow had been neatly shoveled away from the entrance. Josiah raised a hesitant fist and knocked on the heavy timber. The door swung open inward. Warmth, though, glorious, radiant, unbelievable warmth, spilled out into the freezing air, washing over the shivering men like a physical embrace. Catherine stood in the doorway. She was not huddled in a corner. She was not freezing. She wore a simple wool dress, a clean white apron, and she was holding a steaming tin mug of dark chicory coffee. She looked at the battered, frost-bitten, soot-stained men with calm, clear eyes. "Mayor Calloway." "Mr. Miller," Catherine said quietly, her voice steady. "You look half frozen. Come inside before you catch your deaths." The men stumbled over the threshold, completely dumbfounded. As the door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the bitter cold, they stared at the interior of the cabin. It was a haven. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. The air smelled of coffee, baking bread, and strangely, the sweet, earthy scent of summer fields. Then Harrison noticed the walls. Along the western side of the cabin, the interior pine planks had been removed from the bottom up. The cavity between the outer and inner walls was exposed, and it was empty. The hay that had been packed tight was gone, revealing the thick exterior timber. Harrison walked slowly toward the exposed wall, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He touched the rough wood, then looked toward the heavy door that led to the lean-to. He could hear the soft, contented sounds of livestock moving around inside. He turned back to Catherine, his eyes wide with a sudden, crushing realization. "You," Harrison stammered, his voice breaking. "You didn't just insulate the house. You fed the walls to your cattle." Catherine took a sip of her coffee and nodded slowly. "Grass is life on the prairie, Mr. Miller. It traps heat when it's packed tight, and it sustains life when the pastures are buried under 10 feet of ice. A home should protect everything inside it. My animals stayed warm because of the hay, and they stayed alive because they ate it. When spring comes, I'll simply go out to the fields, cut new grass, and pack the walls again." She gestured toward the far window, which looked out over the valley toward the ruins of Harrison's property. "Green timber bends under pressure. Haste builds a coffin, not a barn. I told you I built this home to survive." Silence stretched across the small, warm room. It was not a tense silence, but the heavy, profound silence of absolute humility. The arrogant men of Bitter Creek, who had built their towering testaments to pride and lost everything, were standing in the warm, secure fortress of a widow they had dismissed as mad. Josiah Calloway slowly took off his snow-crusted hat, holding it respectfully to his chest. He looked at Catherine, then at the exposed walls, his face flushing with deep shame. "Mrs. Bennett," Josiah said softly, his voice trembling slightly. We were fools. Arrogant, blind fools. I am profoundly sorry. Harrison Miller didn't speak. He couldn't. The man who had mocked Catherine for storing horse feed in her walls simply sank into a wooden chair by the fire, buried his face in his bandaged hands, and wept, the warmth of the cabin slowly thawing the ice in his bones. The Great White Hurricane of 1883 forever changed Bitter Creek. Catherine Bennett, once the ridiculed widow, became the undisputed matriarch of the valley. When spring thawed the frozen earth, the settlers didn't just rebuild, they rebuilt her way. Double-walled cabins sprang up across the Dakota Plains, a silent, enduring apology to the woman who proved that survival wasn't about defying the harsh land, but understanding its brutal, unforgiving rules.